Hello, everyone. Welcome to our
Hello.
retake. This is for the members who have signed up. Today we'll be summarizing what we talked about on June 21st during our third culture class. We'll rehash some stuff while adding more information for everybody. So without further ado, let's get started. Also, starting from this start of this month, we'll be doing cooking e-bunka on the 19th. So if you're interested in that, we'll be taking applications. Thank you very much. Okay. So to do with our theme of identity, our self-introductions are very important. So we'll be doing them again. My name is Daniel Huyn. I was born and raised in Birmingham, England. However, my family are originally from China. My parents were born in Vietnam and they were raised there, speaking Cantonese at home and Vietnamese when they were outside. I was raised speaking Cantonese and I spoke English outside because I was in the UK. My parents speak Vietnamese to each other. However, I can't speak Vietnamese at all. I never picked it up. After graduating, I moved from Birmingham to Hamamatsu as part of the JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And it is my second year here. Thank you very much.
So hi everyone, I'm Levi. I was born in Hanoi, Vietnam. But when I was 3, I moved to Singapore with my parents and my older sister. And last year I graduated from university and I moved to Hamamatsu, Japan to work as a coordinator of international relations, doing mostly translation and interpretation work. And so I've been here almost a year now. This August, it'll be a year. So in Singapore, I speak Vietnamese at home with my sister and my parents, but I speak English in school and with friends because English is the main language used in Singapore for communication. So, because we've both experienced more than one culture growing up, we would like to talk about it and how this has affected our identity and how we see the world. So first, we'll be talking about third culture kids and explain what third culture is, the title of this presentation. Next, we'll talk about immigrant kids and how we're actually immigrant kids instead of third culture kids and how it is different from third culture kids. Then we'll talk about identity and mother tongue, which is an important component of identity. Last, we'll talk about the benefits and challenges of growing up with more than one culture. So without further ado, let's start. What is third culture? So third culture kids, or TCKs for short, is a term coined by US sociologist Ruth Hewlett-Usin in the 1950s to describe children who spend their formative years in places that are not their parents' homeland. Usin was studying overseas Americans living in India then, and she first used the term to describe the children of American citizens working and living abroad. So here's a diagram to show you, to further explain third culture kids. They move from their home country to a host country, where they spend their formative years, in other words, their childhood or teenage years we are developing. They may move to one country, or they may move to multiple countries, as seen in this diagram. And they may eventually go back to their home country one day or keep moving on to the next host country. So, to summarize, third culture kids are children who accompany their parents into another society. As a result, they are caught between two or more societies and cultures. Thus, they form a new cultural group that does not fall into their parents' home culture, or the host culture. So the third culture is a combination of the passport culture, the culture of the country in which they have a passport, and the culture of the host country, or host countries, the countries they've lived in. Yes. So here's a diagram to explain it. So it's an intersection between the old home, the parents' home, and the new home, the place where they're living. So another note, third culture kids often refers to children of expatriates. What is an expatriate? Expatriates, or expats for short, refers to people temporarily residing in a country other than their native country. They're often highly paid and highly skilled. So I discovered the concept of third culture kids when I was 18, and I felt that it really resonated with me because I was questioning who I was and where I was from. And I felt caught between Vietnam and Singapore. And third culture gave me a way out. However, there's a difference because I realized I wasn't a third culture kid, but actually an immigrant kid. And so now we'll explain the difference between expatriates and immigrants.
For me, I only found out about the term third culture recently. As a child, I already had a similar realization that I was a mix of different cultures, and all of them were valid ways of differentiating my different identities. However, as Levi noted earlier, we are immigrant kids. So the differences are expats only move to a country to stay there for a limited amount of time, and the term of their stay, the length of their stay, they haven't decided yet. Immigrants, on the other hand, are people who move to a different country in order to live there permanently. Immigrants are divided into different generations depending on when they moved there or how they moved there. So for first generation immigrants, they are people who move from the original home country to their new country, either on their own or with their parents. So in Levi's case, she moved from Vietnam when she was 3 to Singapore. Second generation are people like me and my parents who were born in the host country. So my parents were born in Vietnam when my grandparents moved from China to Vietnam. And then when my parents moved from Vietnam to the UK, and I was born there, it made me a second generation immigrant. Third generation immigrants, on the other hand, for example, if I was to move back to the UK and have children, my children would be third generation immigrants. And it's been a recent phenomenon or trend that third generation immigrants are slowly forgetting their original language. Many of the Chinese immigrants in Birmingham don't speak very fluent Cantonese or Mandarin. So moving on. Another difference between expats and immigrants are more involved in their communities and mix with the locals more often compared to the expatriates. Immigrant kids are often sent to local schools rather than international schools. So here's a diagram. Similar to the TCKs, the third culture kids, they move from the original home to the new home. The immigrant kids do not necessarily know about their original home, and they usually become permanent residents or naturalized citizens in their new home country. Another similarity between TCKs and immigrant kids are they also form a third culture by the overlapping cultures between their old or original home and their new home. So the third culture is their heritage plus the culture of the country of their birth. So here's a diagram. For immigrant kids, they may feel they may feel related to multiple parts of their cultures, but they may not feel like they truly belong. So to summarize, third culture kids are children of expatriates. They are staying in the country temporarily. Their parents are usually on working visas, and they may not be fully immersed in local life and attend international schools and be more involved in the expat community rather than the local community. Immigrant children or immigrant kids are children of immigrants. They're there permanently, and they're naturalized citizens usually, and are fully immersed in local life, local schools, local community. They understand the local culture very well, but may retain the cultural differences from the original country. So again, the third culture is the overlap between the old home or the old culture and the new home or the new culture. And of course, it's not limited to 2. It can be 3 or 4.
So both third culture kids and immigrant kids fall under the bigger umbrella of cross-cultural kids. Cross-cultural kid is anyone who has had meaningful interaction with more than one culture before the age of 18. So often interacting with 2 or more cultures at once can lead to some confusion with regards to identity. So next, we'll be talking about identity. Yes. So identity can be determined by many things. It can be determined by your country of birth, your country of residence, citizenship, ethnicity or race, your culture, your mother tongue, and lastly, self-identification. What do you call home? Where do you feel that you belong? For some people, the answers to all these questions may be the same. For instance, if I were to ask many of you, you were born in Japan, you live in Japan, you have Japanese citizenship, you identify with Japanese culture, Japanese is the language you're most fluent in, and you can call Japan home. So the answer for you, many of you, will be very simple. But for us, the situation might be a little bit more complicated. For instance, in my case, my country of birth is Vietnam, but my country of residence for most of my life was Singapore. So I became a Singaporean permanent resident at 7 years old, and I became a citizen at 16 years old, giving up my Vietnamese citizenship because Singapore does not allow dual citizenship. So when I was growing up, I often thought, was Vietnam my home? Or was Singapore actually my home? Where is home? What is my culture? Who am I? So, and even though I was a Singaporean citizen at 16, I felt that I couldn't really call myself a citizen, Singaporean citizen, because I didn't speak the official languages of Singapore, which is English, Mandarin Chinese, Malay, and Tamil at home. Instead, I spoke Vietnamese, and I eat Vietnamese food, and I consider myself quite culturally Vietnamese. But at the same time, my Vietnamese is very bad. I have a foreign accent. I don't read or write very well because I never studied it formally. I have no Vietnamese friends, and all my friends are Singaporean. So I felt that I couldn't quite call myself truly Vietnamese either. So that led to, I was still wondering, who am I? Yes, I didn't feel completely connected to either Singapore or Vietnam. But as I grew up and I realized that I didn't want to choose either one or the other, but I would embrace both sides. So I decided to call myself a Vietnamese Singaporean, acknowledging that I have Vietnamese roots, but that Singapore is also the only home I've known. So to me, my third culture is Vietnamese Singaporean, as someone with Vietnamese roots, but growing up in Singapore.
For me, my parents were born in Vietnam, immigrated, and I was born in the UK. England is the only home I've ever known. However, because of my appearance, I didn't ever really fit in with everyone. I was British, but I never quite fit in. I was an outsider. I also asked my parents quite a few times, am I Chinese or Vietnamese? We spoke Cantonese at home, but my parents spoke Vietnamese as well. We did both Chinese cultural things as well as Vietnamese, celebrated Vietnamese customs as well. And I always wondered, what am I? Who am I? Where do I belong? So I'm a mix of Chinese, Vietnamese, and British culture. And my third culture is accepting all of that and accepting that I am a mix of different countries and cultures. I can't speak Vietnamese, but I can speak Cantonese. And I can't read or write Cantonese, but I can do English. And while growing up, I was asked many times, where are you from? And I found it very difficult to answer that question because I would always have different answers depending on who would ask. So if I was talking to one of my friends, I would say I was born in Britain and that I'm British. But if I was talking to someone I don't know who was only looking at me from skin level, I would say either Vietnamese or Chinese because that was the answer they were expecting and it was the easiest answer. So to summarize, my third culture is the cross between Chinese, Vietnamese, and British. There are multiple identities for people like us, and we don't have to choose just one.
Yes, so yeah. So like for me, I have both my Vietnamese and my Singaporean side, and for Daniel, he has the British or Chinese and Vietnamese sides. So cross-cultural kids may feel that they have multiple identities. And with friends from the same country, the other side of themselves, which has learned to live in the host culture, and while at home, the other side of themselves, which was raised in the heritage culture. So for me, I would be with my friends, Singaporean friends, I would eat Singaporean food, speak Singlish, talk about Singaporean politics. But at home, I'll be talking in Vietnamese, eating Vietnamese food, talking about Vietnamese politics. And the fusion of both sides lead to a third culture and another side of my identity.
Yes. Identity is deeply linked with mother tongue, and research shows that what you think is your mother tongue can decide what is your identity as well. What is your main, what you feel is your main identity?
Yes, so there are like 4 factors that can determine what is your mother tongue. So first, language inheritance. I mean, what is the language you're exposed to from birth? What language do your parents speak to you in? Next is language expertise, which means how good are you in that language? Third is language function. What language do you use when communicating with members living in the same household? With friends, what language do you talk to yourself in, or think in, or dream in? What language do you watch television in? And last is language identification. What language do you believe is your language? So this can be summarized in 4 short questions, which is, what is the first language to which I am exposed from birth? What is the language in which I am the most proficient? What is the language I use the most? And last, what is the language that I would say is mine? Again, for some people, the answer might be very easy because the answer to all these questions are the same. For instance, if I were to ask many of you, the first language that you were exposed to would be Japanese. Your parents spoke to you in Japanese, raised you in Japanese. And the language you're the best in would be Japanese. And the language that you use the most would also be Japanese because you live in Japan. And what is the language that you say is yours? You would say Japanese. So you can easily say that your mother tongue is Japanese. But for cross-cultural kids, or kids who grow up in two or more societies or cultures like us, the answer might be somewhat complicated. So for instance, in my case, the first language to which I was exposed from birth is Vietnamese. Until 3 years old, all I knew was Vietnamese. But I learned English starting from kindergarten, and then I went to school in English. And so the language in which I'm the most proficient is English, followed by Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese, because I had 10 years of Chinese schooling, and then I studied Japanese formally. As for Vietnamese, while I can talk and listen with no problems, I can't read or write very well. Yes. And the language that I use the most is actually English, because I grew up speaking it, basically. But the language that I would say is mine is Vietnamese. So as you can see, it's a mix between the answers are half Vietnamese and half English. So I have difficulty saying what my mother tongue is.
For me, I was first exposed to Cantonese and Vietnamese. While my parents speak to me in Cantonese, they speak to each other in Vietnamese. So theoretically, I should have picked it up, but I didn't. What is the language I'm more proficient in? Well, in order, English, Cantonese, and then Japanese. While I know more words in Japanese, I am more confident speaking Cantonese because I speak it with my parents at home, I speak it with my friends. It may not be very formal Cantonese. I won't be a speaker anytime soon at a Cantonese speaking conference, but I could speak very confidently in Cantonese. I use English the most, having been raised in the UK. And the two languages that I would say are mine are English and Cantonese. I don't really want to choose just one when it comes to which language I would say is mine, because I feel like I have a right to have both. Okay. So again, the old culture, the languages from your old home, and the new language from your new home, and then the cross in between.
Yes, just like we cannot choose a single language to say is our mother tongue, we cannot choose a single part of our identity. And so our identity is a fusion of both. Now, on to the benefits.
Third culture kids are often multilingual. This is because they're raised in two different cultures. And because of that, also, they have different ways of thinking. They're able to see different cultural viewpoints. Most are able to become a cultural bridge between two countries, and they understand others in similar positions to themselves. So TCK would understand some of the situations of an immigrant kid. Another benefit is that TCKs are also very flexible and adaptive, or cross-cultural kids are flexible and adaptive. They are global-minded and are usually interested in international careers and international affairs. The challenges, as we have mentioned earlier, are identity crises, feelings of isolation and alienation from family or friends, confused loyalties and values, difficulty in finding true cultural balance, ignorance of heritage culture, and gaps in common knowledge of the host culture while growing up. So for me, because I was raised in an immigrant family, my parents didn't know about British cultural customs. So I learned them as I went along in school. Many children in my year would be talking about the latest shows or the latest news that is going on during that time. But I would have no idea about it because my parents watch Vietnamese shows or Chinese shows from China using international satellites. For immigrants with different skin color or appearances like me, we're also seen as outsiders, even if we were born in that country. So, hang on. A case study about my previous point would be there was a girl in Growing Up Among Worlds by Professor Van Recken and Professor Pollock. It was about a British girl who moved to America, and she learned about American customs and British culture at school in America. However, even though she was very knowledgeable about American history, when she went back to Britain, she asked her mum who Guy Fawkes was. And that really surprised her mum, because Guy Fawkes was really famous and is a big part of British history and culture. He is remembered because he's the man who tried to blow up Parliament and replace the king, who was a Protestant king with a Catholic king. And till this day, they burn effigies of Guy Fawkes to remember him by, or to remember the plan. And it's also known as Bonfire Night.
And in my case, because at home I celebrated Vietnamese New Year and I ate Vietnamese food. For instance, this cake called bánh chưng, which translates to earth cake. It's made of glutinous rice, and inside the filling is made of pork and mung beans. And so at home I always ate this, and I never knew how my Chinese friends celebrated the New Year, which is they have this dish called Lohei, as you can see in the picture. It consists of noodles, daikon, sliced carrots, other vegetables, and salmon. And how people eat it is they stand around the big plate, everybody has a pair of chopsticks, and they start mixing the plate, and they try to go as high as possible, because the higher you go, the luckier it is. And I never knew this until I went to middle school, or as we call it in Singapore, secondary school, and I found out about this. So I was somewhat ignorant of this tradition in Singapore.
I remember asking my mom why there were 2 New Years. Because I was confused about the Gregorian calendar New Year and the Chinese New Year. To conclude, third culture kids and immigrant kids are children who grow up in a country that is not their parents' homeland. Oops, that was a bit, thank you. Third culture kids are only there temporarily, while immigrant kids are there to stay permanently. The third culture is the mix of their parents' culture and the culture of the place or places that they grew up in. While there are many benefits to being a cross-cultural kid, there's also challenges such as identity crises or being confused while growing up. Thank you for listening.
Yes. So, yes.
Next is reading materials. I would really like to recommend Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds by Ruth Van Recken and Michael V. Pollock. It has many case studies and quite a lot of insights into what it means to be a cross-cultural kid and the experiences that they all go through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Going into Q&A, please type in your questions in Japanese or English into the chat and we'll answer them. Previously, I received a question about what language that I dream in. Well, I actually dream in English and Cantonese. I also sometimes, very rarely, dream in Japanese. An interesting thing is when I dream in Japanese, I speak much better than I do in real life.
I dream in English and occasionally Vietnamese. Yes. When I'm surprised, I sometimes revert to Vietnamese.
Oh.
Yes. But there are many gaps in my Vietnamese vocabulary. And then sometimes I'll be speaking in Vietnamese and I'll fill in those gaps with English words.
I guess it's the same for me as well. When I get surprised, I would go "aya" in Cantonese. You are both are you happy and when? Yes, I would say that we're both happy.
We are not exactly third culture kids.
Yes.
We are more immigrant kids because Singapore became my permanent home, as I mentioned. And
yes, for me, I was born in the UK, so I'm not a third culture kid. I am an immigrant kid.
Yes, but it took a while for me to realize that I was different from other Singaporeans and then to reconcile that difference within myself. But I guess I am happy sort of when I figured out that I could call myself Vietnamese Singaporean with no, I could call myself that and I made peace with it.
Yes, I have made peace with my identity as well. However, when I was young, it was a bit difficult to come to terms with it being so different. Here we have a good question. How do you release the stress caused by your culture, the third culture kids? Well, rather than stress growing up, it was mostly in my mind coming to terms with who I actually am. I wouldn't say it's stress per se, but it was definitely mentally challenging. It was quite difficult to come to terms with my own identity. So as I said in the presentation, I usually called myself Chinese or Vietnamese depending on the situation. However, now I always say that I'm British Chinese.
For me, I guess the stress comes from when my parents have certain expectations of me due to their Vietnamese upbringing, which I don't agree with because I'm seeing things from the Singaporean perspective. And in that case, I suppose I just have to either convince them or we have to find a compromise. Because I am no longer living in Vietnam anymore.
Yeah.
So I just can't follow directly what they say. My experience is different from theirs.
Yeah. Which country do you think that influences your thinking most? Which country do you think influences your thinking most?
For me, it's Singapore.
Yes, for me, it's Britain, definitely. I am very much British. And while my heritage is from China and Vietnam, my personality, the way I talk, the way I act is very British.
Same. I attended university in Singapore, and that's where I became politically and socially active. And so I'm very much shaped by Singaporean issues.
大学記事として一番困ることはどんなことですか? I think the thing that troubled me the most while growing up was not being fully understood by either my parents and my friends. It is very difficult when you're growing up as a child and I was still learning all these things as I was growing up. So when I asked my parents what these things were in English, well, not in English language, but in the UK, for example, why do British people eat fish and chips, for example? Why do they eat the food they eat? Or how do I do this homework, for example? My parents could never help me. I had to figure it all out by myself. So again, that feeling of isolation was what troubled me the most while growing up.
Same. I guess the feeling was just the biggest trouble was feeling a bit different Even something as small as New Year, when I realized I didn't do this thing for New Year, and nobody knew what I was doing. I just felt like I was alone, and that loneliness is sort of difficult to deal with.
Yes. I also started school when a bit later. I was 5, and I was at home schooled, so I was homeschooled until then. So I only spoke Cantonese. I didn't know any English at all. However, my parents threw me into local school, and everybody was suddenly speaking a different language. I didn't understand anything, and I remember there was a spelling test where we had to spell B-E-E, and I couldn't spell it because I had no previous knowledge. And I remember crying a lot when I was younger. Do you have any advice for young TCKs and their parents? Advice. Well, I would recommend the parents to try and understand things from the child's perspective, because for you who have moved to this country to work, you eventually you think that you will go back home. You have plans to go back home. However, for the child, their memory of their old home may not be as clear as yours, and to them it may not really be home anymore.
Yes, like my parents moved to Singapore when they were in their early 40s. By that time, they knew who they were. They knew where their home was. They spoke Vietnamese perfectly. They had a very clear idea of who they were. But for me, I moved when I was 4, so I didn't know who I was, and I learned who I was in Singapore. So even though so Singapore's really all I've known, and
same with me and UK.
Yeah, so I think sometimes my parents assume that I'm Vietnamese, but I am only half so perhaps. So it would be good to, I suppose, talk about that and understand that your child might not be as involved in your culture as you might like. My parents scold me for not speaking good enough Vietnamese, but eventually I learned to like it, and now I actively try to study on my own. So I just be understanding and talk to them about it.
Next one's a question about the situation in America right now between what's the segregation between white and black?
So the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
So for those of you who don't know, so recently there have been a lot of marches and protests in the United States because of police brutality against African Americans.
Yes.
And so, yes, because they're not being treated like American citizens, even though they are. And the assumption is only white American citizens are American citizens. And I would say that racism is not just a problem in America,
but
around the world as well. And this idea of there's a true American citizen, but really identity is fluid, as we can show. And
what do we think? Well,
I stand with them.
I stand with them.
Definitely,
yes.
as
Black Lives Matter.
Yes, as people who are not in a dominant culture. We are sort of in a minority culture. Me being a Vietnamese in mostly Chinese Singapore, and then
I've been a minority as
Chinese
well.
in mostly white British society. We believe that even though we're the minority, we matter.
We do matter.
Yes, and
how did the people around you help you when you were in trouble? Well, again, I felt alone, but I wasn't completely alone because I had others like me. For example, my Pakistani friends who moved, whose parents moved to the UK, they were in the same situation as me. I was lucky enough to learn Cantonese. However, a lot of my Pakistani friends can't speak Urdu anymore, and we used to talk to each other about. We just used to play together, and even we had an unspoken bond. think having other people in similar situation really helped me.
Yes, similar. In my case, I too had an unspoken bond with other immigrants. So.
Okay, I think this is all we have time for.
Yes.
Thank you very much for
your
tuning
questions.
in.
Yes, there were a lot of questions. Thank you very much for your enthusiastic participation.